Morning. I'm wondering this morning how many of you have been on a road trip. I suspect that many of you have been, either because you wanted to or because you had to. You've had a wedding or a funeral or something you had to go to, or holidays or something or other, and you've gone driving somewhere a little bit longer perhaps than your normal trip. Well, I want to talk about a road trip, and one of the things that I find interesting as I think back through some of the trips I've been on is that some of them I remember very clearly. Some of the road trips I've been on, I can recall the details. And other trips I've been on, I really can't remember much at all. I know I went, I know I was there, but I really don't have much recall of what happened or the details of the trip. And it was curious to me as to why that might be. Like why some I remember and some I don't. And so I'll tell you about one trip, one that I remember. This was a trip where we were going with our family to the coast. We'd booked campgrounds in White Rock near the beaches, and it was the trip to take our eldest child to university. So that's kind of a significant event for a family. And we didn't know one way or the other, but we thought it might be the last camping trip we took together as a family. Once the kids grow up and start going to university, you don't know if you're going to have that opportunity again. And so we packed up the van and hitched up the tent trailer and started off across Alberta and across BC. And the truth is, I really can't remember very much about the trip from Alberta to Kamloops. But from Kamloops on, I remember almost every detail. And I think you'll understand why as I go along. You see, when we pulled out of Kamloops and started climbing those high, steep, long hills of the Coquihalla, I started to notice that the transmission was skipping every now and then. Now, I was trying to keep the worry to myself so the family could have a good time and didn't have to worry about these things. But I was starting to wonder that in the beginnings of our trip if we'd even make it home. And so we got up the hills and got down to Merritt, and I guess on the way down the transmission cooled off and performed a little better again. And then we climbed up from Merritt into the mountains again and through the passes and down into the lower mainland. And it wasn't too bad. We got to the campgrounds and parked the camper. It was a very different kind of camping in the city than what we were used to, but there's lots of fun on the beaches, and we went to the parent orientation at Trinity Western, and we did all the things that we had planned to do and had a good time. Then we had that time when we had to leave our daughter at university, the first one, and these cold hard eyes even shed a tear, and if you can believe that, doesn't happen very often for me. And so then we packed up, put the camper down and hitched it up and started on our way back. And you know, it wasn't too bad. It wasn't too bad as we left Vancouver and made our way to Merritt. And we decided to go through Kelowna on the way back, a different route because we're on holidays and wanting to see different things. And so as we climbed out of Merritt into the high mountains again, the transmission really started. Like, I couldn't keep it from the family now because it was so obvious. I had to shift down into second and into first and just go in the shoulder and just crawl up the mountains and then get to the top. And as we'd go down, try and coast as much as possible and cool off the transmission and try to climb the next hill. And it was just getting very painful. And of course, it was a long weekend. So as we got to the first big gas station in the West Bank area, we pulled off, and I just did all the checks I could. I mean, I checked the fluid level, I checked for leaks, I checked this, I checked that. We waited a few hours for the transmission fluid to cool off, and we didn't know what to do. We were on our phones and trying to find some place that could help, and everyone was closed. It's the long weekend, and we couldn't do anything. So I thought, well, this isn't a good place to stay, so we'll just try and get a little further and see what happens. And so we got in the van, and it wasn't too bad through Kelowna because it's kind of flat there. And as we left Kelowna, I don't know if you know the area, but we climbed a little bit just outside of Kelowna, and it just completely quit. I had no forward motion. And that happened just as we were coming to the top of a hill. So I could see the highway going down, but it's the mountains. So there's cliffs and there's banks and there's rocks, and I'm thinking, okay, I can see that we can coast for quite a ways. There's quite a long downhill. So my only priority is to find some place where we can pull off the highway. I don't want to be stuck with my children and my family and my camper on the side of the road on this busy highway on a holiday weekend, and just sitting there on the road. So we were coasting down the hill, and I'm just thinking, Lord, I need a place to turn off. I don't care what it is. I don't care where it is. Just give me a place to pull off the highway. So I could see the hill ending, and I could see the highway turning up again, and I'm thinking, there's no place to turn off. And then I saw a place where the highway widened out, and there was a large gravel shoulder on the outside of the paved shoulder. So I thought, okay, we can pull off the highway. So I pulled off onto the gravel, and I noticed that the gravel was actually the pull-off for a road that turned down the side of the highway like this. And so I went down that road, and as we were coming to the bottom and it's starting to flatten out, there was a big sign over a turnoff on the side of the road for the Wood Lake RV Park. And so I pulled in there, and it's a long weekend, so everything's full. So I'm going by, and they were slowing down and slowing down and slowing down, and I go by one spot. There was an open spot. So I turned and pulled into this open spot in the campgrounds. And we thought, well, at least we're off the highway. I was sure that being a long weekend this close to Kelowna in a little campgrounds that there would be someone already paid for and booked that spot. But we went up to the office, and sure enough, the spot we were in was the spot that was available for rent. And so we paid for the spot, and we had to wait till Tuesday till anything opened up in Kelowna. And what we didn't anticipate is that the campgrounds there was one of the nicest campgrounds we've ever been to, and the lake was one of the nicest lakes we've ever been to, and so we had one of the nicest holidays we've ever had. Despite the fact that on Tuesday morning I thought I'd have to call a tow truck, but it turns out that I was able, without the camper attached, to limp the van, driving in the shoulder in second gear, back into Kelowna and get to a transmission shop. And then we had to wait for a transmission to be shipped from Ontario, and then we had to wait for it to be installed. And I called the elders back at the church and said I wouldn't be there, and they said, well, we'll take care of things here, you take care of things there. And so finally everything was fixed. And we hitched up and drove home. And the church had taken up an offering that Sunday for us and paid for our repairs and our extra expenses. And it turned out to be somewhat of a blessing. Now, I only told you the outline, but I can remember every detail. I can remember the blackberries. I can remember. And there's other trips I've been on that I can't remember much of anything. I know a lot of things happen, but I can't remember them. And I was wondering, well, what's the difference? And the difference is that trip, because of its hardships, was a time of intense growth. It was a time of learning to trust God, learning to experience the joys in the midst of trials, learning to come closer together as a family, and of course, with our eldest child going to university, it was kind of a life milestone kind of moment in our lives as well. Well, I don't mean to compare my life to Leviticus, but Leviticus is a road trip too, full of trials. Our trials don't even come close to what they go through in Leviticus, but there are some similarities in how we apply what we learn in Leviticus to our lives. And I want to turn to that in the second part of this service. But as we think about our lives, it's not uncommon for us to have the impression or have the thought or the feeling that we might not be on the right road. And that's not uncommon. That's one of the most common things, in fact, that pastors deal with as people come asking for spiritual advice and that kind of thing. And I think Leviticus can help us with this issue to some extent. But we need to understand the breadth of the story. And for that reason, in this occasion, I'm going to summarize or go through Leviticus, hopefully fairly briefly, but there's a lot in there. I know some of you have read it, and some of you have skimmed it, and some of you meant to read it and didn't, and there's quite a number of you that aren't trying to keep up in that way, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with any of those things, but to understand what I want to impress upon you today, we have to kind of summarize the story. So we begin on Mount Sinai. That's where Leviticus starts, and God's people have been there already for quite some time, because half of Exodus is on Mount Sinai, or near Mount Sinai, and all of Leviticus is Mount Sinai, and now we come to Numbers, and they're still at Mount Sinai. So God's people spent approximately a year there. All the things that happened, the giving of the law, the building of the tabernacle, the installment of the Levitical priesthood, all of that stuff took about a year to complete, and they were still in that one location. And so when we open our Bible to Numbers, they're getting ready to finally depart. The promise to Abraham was the promised land, the land of Canaan, and the promise to Moses was that God would deliver the people out of Egypt and bring them to the promised land, and they've been just sitting there for a year. And so you could understand perhaps a little bit of impatience at that time. So the first thing that we come to in Numbers is the namesake of the book, and that is the numbering of the people, the census. And so as they count the people, we get bored because we can't pronounce their names, and they go on and on. And so just a sidebar here, this isn't part of what I want to preach on this morning, but as you struggle through those names, and as I've said many times already, I think it's worth your while to take the struggle to read through them. The thing that I think ought to be impressed upon you is that every person matters. Have you ever gone to the gas station or Canadian Tire or something, and they have the big rack of keychains with all the names on them? Well, some people page through that, and they look for their letter, and their name's there every time. Other people do that, and their name's never there. And I can tell you, because some of those people are in my family, it doesn't feel good when your name's never there. In Numbers, all the names are there. Everyone is accounted for. God cares for each person. He doesn't want to leave anyone behind. They're all accounted for. They're all given their proper place. They're all giving their proper marching orders. Everyone matters. No one's insignificant. They're all counted. It reminds me as I read those pages of the passage where Jesus says that even the hairs on your head are numbered. God cares about the details. And so it's worth reading just to meditate on those details and see that they're important to God. Now, the other thing that happens there is the layout of the camp is given. And so in the next picture, we have it there. Thank you. The layout of the camp is a theological picture. It doesn't matter who you are, which family or tribe you belong to. When the camp is set up according to God's instruction, when you open the flap of your tent and look out, in the daytime at the center of the camp, you can see the pillar of smoke over the Holy of Holies. And in the nighttime, you can see the pillar of light over the Holy of Holies, God's presence at the center of his people. And then as they begin to travel finally, the orders in terms of how they're to arrange themselves for travel is also significant theologically, because the Levites were to go first. So when the pillar raises from the tabernacle and begins to move, the Levites jump into action. It doesn't matter if it's night or day. Pack it up, do it all correctly, put the Ark of the Covenant on the poles, and follow that cloud. And so the Ark goes first. So when they travel, God's presence is at the front. Every time, all the time. When God stops, they stop and arrange themselves appropriately with Him at the center. And when God moves, they move appropriately with God at the front. Now, as you read through Numbers, it's easy to forget these little details. But you have to keep that in mind as you go through all the struggles in this story, that this is still remaining consistent, no matter what else is happening. Now, the key passage there is chapter 9, verses 15 to 23. This is the instructions about how God will guide His people. And I think you kind of have to understand that if you're going to understand the story. So that's a key passage if you're just reading the key passages to keep in mind. God will guide His people. So they start traveling, and their first trip is from Mount Sinai to a place called Paran. And a few things happen along the way, as do in road trips. It starts off great. I mean, they've been preparing for a year. They've been through the Red Sea. God has provided for them. They have this amazing tent that illustrates God's presence. They have the ceremonies and sacrifices in place. They know how to relate to God. Things are all in place, and they start off, as most trips do, with anticipation and hope. The promised land is ahead. But it doesn't last long. I don't know if you noticed, but 3 days in, they're complaining and want to go back to Egypt. There's something about leeks and onions in there. I don't know if I'd go back to Egypt for leeks and onions, but it must have been pretty bad what they were experiencing. With my kids on road trips, it doesn't take 3 days till the complaining starts, but 3 days. God sends fire from heaven when they complain. It seems kind of harsh. God relents, stops the fire. And then God sends quail from heaven. Thousands and millions of quail flying so low that they just have to lift up sheets and catch them. And they're stuffed, overfilled with quail. There's a mutiny within the family. Aaron and Moses' sister are trying to take over the leadership from him. And this is all just in the first days of their travels. They arrive through these things. I don't have time to give the details of those different experiences, but they're all there in the story. But they arrive at Paran, and this is the place where they're to set up and prepare to enter the land of promise. They decide to send out spies, 12 spies, into the land, and the spies go out through the land, and they see what's there, and they come back with their report. And this is the one you know well from Sunday school. Should we sing it? 10 were bad and 2 were good. Some of you know that song. It comes to mind immediately. And it's true. 2 of the spies said it's a wonderful land. It's flowing with milk and honey. It's got everything we dreamed of. And God will deliver it into our hands. Look what He did in Egypt. Look what He did at the Red Sea. God will deliver it into our hands. But 10 of the spies said the people are strong and the cities are fortified and there's giants in the land, and there's no way. If we go in there, we will be utterly destroyed. And those 10 persuaded the people. And once again, the people rebel. They don't want to go in. God's ready to go. The people don't want to go. It says that those who rebelled at that time, that through a number of experiences there you can read about, the earth itself opened up and swallowed them, tents and mothers and children and everybody. Again, to our sensibilities, it seems a little bit much. But there it is. It's interesting. It's incredible, I think, to just think about that story. Like, think about the pillar of cloud going towards the land, and the priests with the ark, and all the things they'd experienced, and yet they say, no, we won't follow. We won't go there. They choose a leader to take them back to Egypt. We won't follow Moses anymore. We won't follow God anymore. We think the punishment is harsh, but it seems incredible that God would turn around. It seems incredible that God would honor their choice of unfaithfulness and turn around and still go with them, even when they go the other way. But that's what he did. Despite their rebellion, he went with them. They travel from Paran to Moab. Now this is the bulk of the book because this takes 40 years to get from Moab, or from Paran to Moab. Many experiences are detailed for us, but given the number of years, I suspect there's many experiences that are not detailed for us in that trip. You probably know this, or maybe you don't, but it takes about 3 days to walk that distance. If you have a company the size that they did, it probably takes about 11 days with your herds and flocks to get between Paran and Moab. It took 40 years to walk 11 days worth of distance. They obviously didn't go in a straight line. There's the pictures there. Kind of shows their ramblings around. They didn't take the long road, they took the convoluted road. During this time, as I said, there was mutiny. They chose a different leader. God swallowed them up. The very next day, after the earth opened up and swallowed up all those who had rebelled, the people were complaining against Moses again. The very next day. We have the experience of Aaron's staff budding. It's an interesting story. That staff ended up in the Ark of the Covenant as a symbol, as a reminder to the people. We have the struggle of the thirst and the water from the rock. This is when Moses rebelled and disobeyed God, and God said, you can't even go into my promised land because of your failure. We have Edom telling them they can't walk through the land, and so they have to go a long way around. We have a war with Arad, and the people rebel, and God sends snakes. And when Moses puts a bronze snake on a cross and puts it up, and if they look there, they'll be healed. It's another foreshadow of Jesus that would come. We have a war with Sihon and a war with Og. Many different experiences through these 40 years. But one thing is clear. God makes it clear. All of those people who turned around and said, we won't go into the promised land, they died in the wilderness. None of them went in. But their children did. And we come to that in Deuteronomy next week, but their children did. And as we read these stories and think about, with our, what we call civilized sensibilities, we live in a different world, the punishments seem extreme. But the thing that we need to never forget is that throughout these experiences, no matter what was happening, no matter whether there was fire from heaven or war from enemies or whatever was happening, every day, if you got up in the morning and looked out your tent, there in the center of the camp, above the Holy of Holies, was the presence of God. Every time when you packed up to travel again, there in the front was the Ark of the Covenant with the pillar of fire above it. Every morning there was manna on the ground. Whenever you were thirsty, water spewed out of the rock. The Bible even tells us that the soles of their shoes didn't wear out for 40 years. They didn't need new clothes. God sustained them. God continued to be with them. God continued to be faithful through that time. And when we read those stories of struggle, it's easy to forget that God's presence remained. His protection, His care remained, even through those things. And then at the end of the book, we come to a story that kind of hits that point home more strongly than anything else. It's the story we love to tell in Sunday school of Balaam. I'm not going to tell you this part of the story where the donkey talks. You'll have to go in there and read it for yourself. But that's where it happens. I think when we tell the story that way, we misunderstand a little bit about it, because it, for little children, we don't always tell the scary stuff. But just think for a moment the kind of country that these people are in. There's fortified cities. There's other nomadic peoples around. There's kings. There's wars, not just between Israel and the others. There's wars between the other tribes and clans and kingdoms in the area. And everyone's trying to be strong. Everyone's trying to be stronger than the others. So one of these strong men is named Balak. He's a king. He's etched out a part of the territory. He's got people who are loyal to him, and he's going to defend that. And now these people are coming through his land. This mob of people is coming through his land. So he seeks out someone who would help him. And this man's name is Balaam. And he's going to hire Balaam to put a curse on God's chosen people. Now think about what kind of man Balaam must be. If a guy who has etched out a kingdom in that brutal landscape honors Balaam enough to hire him to do his bidding, I'm thinking Balaam must be a pretty formidable character. He doesn't worship God. He worships the idols. He worships Satan. He's the evil we're all scared of. He's the one that the king of the land is going to hire to put a curse on God's people. He seems to be independent from the kingdoms. As you read the story, he doesn't seem to be a servant or a normal hireling of this king. He seems to be an independent character of the kind of strength and fear in the land that a king would go to him and say, I want you to help me. Maybe he was for hire for various kings to the highest bidder. I don't know. But I think it's obvious that Balak would look to the best in our situation as God's people, the worst he could find. I imagine Balaam as a guy that when he comes near, everyone just shakes in fear. When he gives a curse, you die. When he says, I need a sacrifice, you give whatever he asks for. We don't know those details. They're not told to us. But I can't imagine a king would go to some, the kind of person we sometimes think of Balaam as a foolish, stumbling bumbler with a donkey. He was that, but I think he was much more. And we get this, I get this more from the rest of the story, which I'm going to tell you now. Balaam agrees. Okay, I'll curse these people. He goes up in the mountains, he does the proper preparations, and he goes to give the curse. And when he opens his mouth, the only thing that comes out is blessing. So he's okay. Must have done something wrong. Must have done the ceremony wrong. Must have given the wrong sacrifices. Must have done something wrong. Call on different gods. I don't know what he did. Try again. The only thing that comes out of his mouth is blessing. 4 times. Balaam, the scariest Satan worshiper in the land, the most powerful person, blesses God's people when he intends to curse them. And the third blessing, you should read it sometime, is almost exactly like the kind of promise that God gives to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will bless you, I will bless your descendants, and from your descendants I will bless all the nations. And that's why I think Balaam must be a scary guy. Because if I was the king and I hired someone to curse those people and he blessed them 4 times, I'd just kill him. But the king doesn't do that, probably because he's scared of this guy. Wouldn't dare. He's too powerful. And so the king has to be satisfied with blessings on his enemies. Now, the reason I tell that story in more detail than the others, because I think it brings home the point that I'm trying to get across here this morning. And that is, God's people are down there in their camp. They're complaining. They think God is leading them astray. They don't want to go where God wants to take them. They go the other way. They don't appreciate the food he gives them. They're just carrying on like a bunch of children down in the valley. And unbeknownst to them, up in the mountain, the scariest guy on earth is trying to curse them. Where's God? He's in the middle of the camp, yes, but he's also up on the mountain protecting them from the curse. How much worse might it have been if the curse had gone through? They didn't know that was going on. But there it was. God was looking out for them, even outside of their sphere of knowledge. And despite the fact they thought it was bad, God was making sure it wasn't too bad. God was faithful. God remained faithful through that time, through those struggles. God was blessing them, even through their enemies. The key passage there is Numbers 22, 1 to 24, 25. That's the longest key passage I've given you. But I think you can manage reading the story of Balaam. It's an interesting story. You know, just like these people, just like my road trip that doesn't really compare to this Levitical or this Numbers road trip at all, just about everything you do starts out with happy hopes. Just about everything. When you get married, when you start a job, when you go off for university, when you have a child, when you buy a new house, when you buy a new car, even trivial things like when you go to the grocery store, you have the anticipation of good food on your table. Almost everything you do begins with happy hopes. But if you've lived very long, you also know that almost everything you do that starts out with happy hopes ends up in trouble, runs into trouble at some point. The stake burns. That husband that was going to give you all that joy turns out to be a obstinate You put in the adjectives. You know them better than I do. That child that you look forward to just disobeys and disobeys and disobeys. That job that looked so promising. The boss hires someone else you can't stand and it becomes a misery. At some point or other, everything we start out on turns into trouble. And you begin to wonder if there's an easier road. You begin to wonder if you're on the wrong road, if you made a wrong turn, if you should go a different way, if you could find a way that didn't have so much trouble on it. And you make a decision, you turn, you go another way, and you have high hopes and happy dreams again. And it might be a week, it might be 2 years or longer, but that new road will run into trouble. It will. Every road has trouble on it. There is not an easier road. At least not a road that leads to life. The road that leads to where God wants you to be will take you through terrible failure and crushing conflict. That doesn't mean he's not faithful. It doesn't mean he's not still there at the center of the camp. It doesn't mean there's not manna in the morning. It doesn't mean he doesn't go before with the ark. It doesn't mean he's not up in the mountains protecting you from further harm. But there will be trouble on the road. There are spiritual leaders who teach you, who try to teach you, that God is here to solve your problems and make your life comfortable and to make you prosperous. And I think the biggest problem with this message, that God's purpose is to make you comfortable and prosperous, to take you on a road that doesn't include suffering. The biggest problem with that is they don't take the unholiness that is in your heart seriously enough. That's my biggest issue. That's your biggest issue. I don't take the evil in my own heart seriously enough. Remember last week what we learned? Or not last week, the week before in Leviticus? Holiness comes before happiness. Holiness comes before happiness. God does want us to be happy. The promised land is there and it's wonderful. But holiness comes first. We need to be prepared to receive his promise. The human heart is full of evil. And God wants to change it. But some of the things that are evil in my heart, I hold dearly to. I love them. And if they're going to be ripped out of my heart, it's going to be painful. But do I want holiness? Or do I want happiness? Do I want comfort and ease? Comfort and ease doesn't lead to happiness. Holiness leads to happiness. God says, I'm not here to cuddle you, the same way in which a surgeon says to the cancer-stricken child, I'm not here to hug you. I'm here to take the cancer out. I'm here to give you life. I'm here to give you abundant life, but there's something inside you that is killing you. None of us, if our child has cancer, would want a doctor that would hug them for 2 months till they die. We know it's going to hurt, but we tell the doctor, go in there and get the cancer. Take it out. That's what we see in Leviticus. You see, these people, this nation of Israel, has been slaves for 400 years. You don't think they've developed some bad habits and thought patterns? It takes God 40 years to remove those things and make them into a people that are ready to receive his promise. And some of it's painful. God says in Leviticus, I'm here to purify you, not to hug you. I love you, yes, but I want you to be pure. I want you to be holy. So let's review these Old Testament books, because it kind of fits together when we look at them together. In Exodus on Mount Sinai, we learn that God is holy. And you should spend time in Exodus, in those passages, meditating and thinking and imagining, because it will put the fear of God in your heart. God is holy. He's so holy that unholiness cannot touch him. And if you know anything about your own heart, that's a scary thing. The fear of God, the Bible tells us, is the beginning of wisdom. God is holy. Spend time in Exodus and learn of his holiness. Leviticus, the giving of the law, teaches us something different. It teaches us, as we're told in Romans, the law tells us and tells them, you can't become holy by your own effort. Just try it. Here's the laws. If you can do all of this perfectly, then you're holy enough to come into my tabernacle or up my mountain. Not a single person that's ever tried has made it. The law, Leviticus, teaches us that we can't make ourselves holy. So Exodus, God is holy. Leviticus, I'm not holy. But then Leviticus has another message. God will provide a way that you can approach him anyway. And it involves sacrifice. In the Old Testament, the sacrifice of lambs and goats and bulls, that God graciously allowed to take my sins onto that animal and sacrifice it instead of me, that I could enter the holy place and worship him and be near him. Of course, we know that Jesus is the lamb that all of those sacrifices was pointing towards. So then it would be reasonable, and I think this is what the children of Israel thought when they were about to go into the land and then got chicken feet and went the other way, to think like we're asked in Romans. Well, if God is going to give us this grace, then why don't we just go on sinning if he's going to forgive the sin anyways? What's Paul's answer to that question in Romans? God forbid that you would think that way. You're not taking holiness seriously enough. Yes, God is gracious and provides a way for you to approach him even though you are not holy. But he still wants you to be holy. And so he takes you down the path of Leviticus. And he says to you, when the desert is dry and there's no food in the pantry and your stomach is growling, do you value comfort or do you want me? You have to make a choice. And when the enemy armies are camped out in front of them, and remember when Moses' arms were up, they won, and when they were down, they lost? Do you trust me or do you trust your own strength? You have to decide. And so piece by piece, step by painful step, God takes the unholy attitudes and thought patterns and unfaithfulness out of them, until they're ready to do something as stupid as march around Jericho 7 times. Who would obey an order like that? Only the people who had been through Leviticus. Only those kind of people. Only those kind of people would be faithful Now, they weren't faithful for long even then, and there was more lessons to learn. It's a hard message, I know that. But I do believe it's true. And the reason I'm so confident is because I didn't make this message up. I have on the screen two passages which I'm not going to read because I'm looking at the clock and I know you can all read. And so the first one is 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 to 13. Go ahead and write that down. 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 to 13 is a commentary on Leviticus by the Apostle Paul. And you know what he's going to tell you? Exactly what I've just told you. Different words, different presentation, but he interprets the suffering in the wilderness exactly as this, as a purification, as a making God's people holy. And then Hebrews chapter 3, verse 7 to 19 is another commentary. I know it just says 7 to 9 because that's the first slide, but they're going to go through to 19. Hebrews chapter 3, 7 to 19 is another commentary on the Old Testament Levitical suffering. And it tells us again that the purpose of that suffering and suffering in our lives is to make us holy, to purify us. The road to the place where God wants you to be is difficult and long. But it's more rewarding and more fulfilling than another road. It doesn't matter which road you choose, there will be suffering. But if you choose to follow the Lord, there will be fruit from that suffering. I'm not saying that all suffering comes from God. I'm not saying that all suffering has a meaning or has a specific purpose that you should say, oh, God is giving this to my life so I can learn this. That's not what I'm saying. Suffering is random. It's terrible. None of us should desire it or seek it out. But there is a way to engage in life that says, I trust God. Because we forget in the suffering, the pillar of cloud is still there in the center. The manna is still on the ground every morning. And in the Corinthian passage, what I talked about with Balaam is stated. He will not tempt you beyond what you're able. In other words, he will provide lessons, but he's also there outside of your sight, protecting you. He will be faithful. So what's the final sentence? This one's a long one because I couldn't get it down further, but in Numbers, God says, I don't know, can you read that? In Numbers, God says, you will experience terrible failure and crushing conflict on the road that leads to where I'm taking you. But it's the right road, even if it feels like it's killing you. It's the right one. Remember, Exodus, God is holy. Leviticus, I can't make myself holy. But God provides a way for me to be with him anyways. Numbers, even in God's grace, he still wants me to be holy, but it's not my job to make myself holy. It's his job to make me holy if I'll follow him. If I'll follow him. You know, when the people turned around and said, we're not going to go in to the land, the cloud of God's presence still went in front of them. When it stopped, they camped. And when they camped, they complained. And when it moved, they moved for 40 years. God led them through all of those sufferings. He never left them. He never stopped loving them. He did punish them. There are consequences when we make bad decisions. He doesn't take that away magically. But he stays with his people. And he will stay with you through whatever your path leads to.
Let's pray. Father, thank you for the wonderful reminder that no matter what we're walking through, that you are with us. And God, just thank you so much that your word always does speak. And thank you that you will never leave our side. You will carry us when it gets hard. And thank you for carrying Cynthia and Jose right now. And God, we just commit this week to you. We just pray that no matter, I don't know what's going through the heart of everybody sitting here this morning, but I know that no matter what they're going through, I just pray that they take refuge in the fact that your love is steadfast and you will not leave them. So Lord, let us stand firm in that and just remind one another, even in the week ahead, that you are always there for us. We thank you for your love and your steadfastness in our life. In Jesus' name, amen. Have a great week.